Today is Thursday, October 23rd, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. Are we all going to be replaced by robots? We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to leave a rating, subscribe. You can email us as well, quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. We're glad you're here, getting through the news of the day with us. We're here each and every weekday, bright and early. Joining me today, CBN's Trey Goins-Phillips and Billy Hallowell. On the focus story, Billy, a man who's kind of spent his whole life in Hollywood believes something is changing. What's the story here?
Yeah, Dr. Ted Baehr from Movie Guide has been, as you said, in Hollywood his entire life, and he believes we're seeing a resurgence of faith-based content based on some very interesting factors we'll break down today.
All right, looking forward to the details there. And on the main thing, tensions are heating up in our own hemisphere. President Trump's hard line on Colombia is sparking a bit of a diplomatic showdown. Caitlin Burke has more on that for today's main thing. All right, subscribe to all of our CBN News podcasts. You know what to do. They're right there, the links in the description of this podcast episode. And don't forget, November 2nd, 3rd, and 5th, get your tickets at cbnfilms.com for Oracles of God, the story of the New Testament from CBN Films. You don't want to miss that. It's in theaters November 2nd, 3rd, and 5th. All right, with that, we are going to head to the news now in 90 seconds. And Vice President J.D. Vance is in Israel meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, expressing confidence that the Trump-brokered Gaza ceasefire can lead to a durable peace. Vance says the U.S. is focused on disarming Hamas and rebuilding Gaza, adding that both Israelis and Palestinians deserve security and stability. Vance announced a new civilian-military cooperation center where Israelis and Americans will coordinate the rebuilding effort, though he emphasized no U.S. troops will be stationed in Gaza. Meanwhile, Israel says Hamas still has around 20,000 fighters left after losing roughly the same number in recent months. A newly exposed Hamas Arrow unit is reportedly acting as a brutal internal police force, suppressing dissent through executions and propaganda videos. And leaked internal documents suggest Amazon may be plotting to replace roughly 600,000 American workers with robots by 2027. While doubling sales by 2033. The plan, according to the New York Times, would automate up to 75% of Amazon's facilities, saving them about 30 cents per item and avoiding the need to hire 160,000 new employees. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out more stories over at cbnnews.com. And guys, this is now, not all of us work in Amazon, but it's hard not to think we are approaching, whether it's in our lifetimes or maybe our kids or our grandkids, an era where it's going to be very Star Wars-esque, where they have droids doing a lot of the basic tasks and things that, manual labor, those sorts of things, driving trucks across country. Now we've got cars that are automated. I don't know that we're really fully grasping what's ahead as far as technology, and it's going to be very interesting to see how Christians handle this as opposed to the secular world, because obviously as Christians we know none of this is a surprise to God. He's not going, oh, I didn't foresee them having technology that would do all this stuff. And so we know there's still a good plan for us, and we know that humans were made in the image of God, and so can't really replace us by robots. Just kind of means the landscape changes, but I think it's going to be changing in maybe more of a dramatic way than we think. And this Amazon story is kind of just a little glimpse of what we may be seeing more in the future.
Yeah, I think we have to balance. When it comes to technology, there's good and bad, right? And so the idea that people would be replaced, that opens up obviously a dearth of jobs, but then It also opens up the ability to think more creatively. Like what can we be doing that isn't currently happening? Where can the energy that was being spent on those things that could be automated, where can that energy now go? Are there new things that people can be doing that they weren't doing before? Are there other ways to serve and find jobs? So, yeah, I think it's easy to panic over it and we should be very aware of it, but at the same time also thinking through what does this mean for the needs that still exist out there that maybe aren't being met, or we think up new ways to be creative and smart, again, that we hadn't thought of. So I try to think of it that way. I want to see both sides of it, not just the negative, because the negative can get very scary.
Yeah, I think for the job market in the short term, the things that would happen in the short term are more negative, right? The loss of jobs, and it's going to cause some growing pains, and it will require some stretching, but inevitably it's going to create some other jobs that didn't exist previously, and it does, as you were saying, Billy, I think give us opportunities to be more creative. I think the concerns that I have more focus on the abstract, right? It's like, and these are conversations that we have in Christian circles now, is like, should pastors be using AI to help them write sermons? Is that something that's okay? Is that artificial intelligence and that new technology okay to bring into the pulpit? And what is it doing to our critical thinking skills, not just as Christians, but as human beings? And is it slowing down our ability to really think about moral issues in a deep and really meaningful way? And I think those are conversations that we need to have. And as Christians, AI is not going anywhere. This technology is not going away. So we need to learn, how can we utilize this in a way that's God honoring and true to what we know to be true in Scripture.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to panic, right? And not to be anxious or fearful,
totally.
Because the future is in God's hands. And so we can rest assured in that, even if we can't right now see the forest through the trees with all the crazy technology stuff that's going on. And we can just keep praying that ultimately it's more of a blessing than more of a curse overall. But we'll keep an eye on it, obviously, as things progress. But we're going to head to the focus story now. And few have done more for faith-based and family-friendly cinema than Dr. Ted Baehr, a man who's spent his life in Hollywood. And so tell me about what he's seeing here, Billy.
He's seeing the patterns that we all are, right? He's been, first of all, his parents, and this is important to note, and I didn't know this about him until I got to know him a little bit more. He's the founder of Movie Guide, obviously, and so he's done a lot for families and parents. Movie Guide has all sorts of reviews on films, what's safe, what's not safe for the whole family. But he's also the son of Robert Allen and Evelyn Pierce, who were two very famous actors. His father had a huge career both in film and then also in Broadway. So he grew up in Hollywood, and then in his adult life became a Christian and ended up, founding Movie Guide and really transforming this space. And so what he's seeing is what we all are. We're seeing faith come back into the mainstream. We're seeing projects like House of David, The Chosen. They're going mainstream. There are plenty of movies also as well, in addition to those TV shows. And so it's an interesting time in Hollywood in light of the fact that even 5 years ago, a decade ago, this kind of content, it was really a big there was sort of like a gaping hole where this content wasn't really being produced, or it was happening in silos. And now we're watching it sort of burst out into the mainstream.
Well, he's got a new book out about the topic. So what can you tell us about that?
So the book that he has is Behind the Scenes of the Golden Age of Hollywood and Broadway, The Legacy of Robert Allen. And it's a book where he really honors his father. Again, famous actor, really a legend in Broadway and film. But in addition to that, he looks at a time in Hollywood when it was completely safe. That's why he calls it the Golden Age, where families could go to theaters. There might be difficult topics, but they didn't have to worry about what their kids were going to see. They were seeing content that was safe. And the entire history he actually tracks in our interview, which people will be able to watch on CBN News, on the YouTube channel. He really tracks the different ebbs and flows. When Hollywood first started, it was mostly owned by Christians, the different theaters and also the different production companies. As time went on, that changed. You had the 1960s and 70s and 80s where secularism really came into Hollywood and the faith projects were pushed out. And now we're back on the roller coaster, and we're sort of going up the hill where we're seeing faith come back in a really unique way. And so the book deals not only with his dad's legacy, but also that golden age. And I think helps us sort of think through, well, if we were able to do that before, or we had safe entertainment and we had safe content, why can't we do that again? And how do we continue to clean up the industry currently?
Yeah, and we're talking about technology, but we could also consider building entirely new platforms that are just completely detached from Hollywood, giving parents a safer place to go see content that they know isn't going to be just mainly geared at. I really always say it's the lowest hanging sin fruit there to get people to watch. It's violence, sex, money, that sort of thing. If you look at movie promos, 99% of them have at least one or more of those three things in them because they know that that's what people are tempted by. But what does he think is driving Hollywood's sort of recent uptick, friendlier treatment of Christianity?
Yeah, what you just said was very interesting too, because he talked about the fact, and Movie Guide has put out a number of studies on this, showing that what performs best at the box office is not the sexual content, not necessarily the violent content sometimes, but it's actually the family-friendly content that does collectively the best. And so that's interesting. But what he's seeing, he talked about the fact that we're seeing so many young men come to faith, right? And he said a lot of men drive the box office, obviously. Both women and men do. But when you have more men coming to faith, you have a very interesting situation where Hollywood has to adapt to that. If you've got more Christians all of a sudden who are in a certain demographic, you are going to become more open to the movies and TV shows that audience wants. He said the Wall Street Journal and other places are saying more young men are coming to Christ than young women coming to Christ. And he believes that there's a notable shift because of that. He said, I believe that these young men are coming to Christ. I know it. And that is making a tremendous difference in the box office. So that's something we haven't really talked about with the revival conversation, right? How does that change entertainment? How does that change what people are willing to go see? It doesn't mean people aren't going to go see the secular content, but you do have to consider what that shift will mean for the industry. And it's probably why House of David has been so heavily invested in by Prime.
Yeah, and I always think this is why focusing on evangelizing and the gospel and our sanctification process, because Hollywood, politics, all of those things are going to be downstream of what culture is reflecting. So when politicians, for example, realize that they're going to get more popular when they lean into Christian values or God-centered values because the populace is focusing on that, or that's where most of the populace is at a given time, well, then you're going to see them reflect that. And it's the same thing with culture as well as far as Hollywood goes. If they know, okay, this is the thing that people want, and so I'm going to get skewered if I do something outside of that. There's always going to be people who try to push the envelope. But generally speaking, I think these things are going to be downstream of where people are at as a society. And so that's why it's incumbent on us to be sharing the gospel, to be growing in our walks with the Lord, and to becoming more solid Christians and getting more people into the fold, because that's only going to have a better output on the culture and society around us.
Yeah, and it seems like, I don't know if either of y'all have noticed this, but it seems like more and more the movies that make it into theaters are like darker and darker. So I think that some of that is just there's this huge difference, right? And what is in theaters. And I think people are noticing that. It's like, okay, I can go and see the 18th horror movie that's been released in 2025, or I can go and see this. I'm not even a Christian, but I can go and watch this movie that is being released by a Christian studio, but they're going to see it because it's something that's encouraging. It's like, man, these are the only two options, either this really gory or dark movie or this uplifting movie. And really that's at the end of the day, that's what is encouraging, right? Is people who are not Christians who are going to see it, and then they're thinking maybe for the first time about eternity and thinking about morals and thinking, well, man, this made me think about some existential truths that I've never actually thought about before. Yeah, I think people go into movies and they're willing to engage with those things more than they would, darken the doors of a church on a Sunday morning if they're not a Christian. So it's an awesome ministry opportunity.
Yeah. And, it's interesting, Billy, you said a lot of the data showing young men coming to faith. And it's funny because one of my guilty pleasures is listening to sports radio. I'm a big sports fan. So if I'm driving around, I'll turn on the sports talk. But it's interesting to listen to the ads because it tells you, obviously sports talk is largely male dominated, but it tells you what they think of the people that are listening to that sort of thing. And it's, the ads they're not great. I'll just say that. And so, but I think, Hollywood's probably a lot of the same way. And it's really interesting to see how will they change over time, given the data we're seeing with young men becoming more interested in faith.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a great point, right? And part of this too, we're also seeing a lot of numbers that are concerning in terms of, yes, we're having this revival, but people in the church struggling with morality and understanding the morals and values and what the Bible actually says. So we have an educational sort of dirt that we've got to fix right now. But at the same time, all these people coming in, to your point, if you have an influx of millions of new Christians potentially, that is going to change the marketplace. It's going to shift it. So I'm intrigued to see where this all goes.
As am I. And so we'll continue to keep an eye on it as we go forward here in the coming days and weeks. Appreciate you bringing that one to the podcast today. All right, we are going to go to the main thing now, and tensions are heating up here on this side of the hemisphere. As I mentioned at the top of the podcast, and the war on drugs just took a pretty big geopolitical turn after President Trump accused Colombia's leader of being a drug kingpin. The fallout's been fierce from Bogota to Washington. Today, we're going to dive a little bit into what's behind the escalating clash and what it could mean for America's fight against the cartels. CBN's Caitlin Burke has the report for today's main thing.
Colombian President Gustavo Petro rejected Trump's accusations, describing himself as the main enemy of drugs in his country. A statement from the Colombian Foreign Ministry calls the comments, quote, a direct threat to national sovereignty. Still, President Trump isn't backing down.
They make drugs. They refine drugs. They make cocaine. They have cocaine factories. They have no fight against drugs.
This latest escalation follows a series of U.S. strikes on alleged drug boats in the region, the most recent this past Friday. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth posting on X that the vessel had connections to a Colombian terrorist organization and carried a substantial amount of narcotics. Pentagon Press Secretary Kingsley Wilson tells CBN News the U.S. military is defending the homeland at the direction of the president.
Every single one of these boats that is struck, countless American lives are saved. These individuals are narco-terrorists. They're trafficking illegal narcotics all over the hemisphere, poisoning our people, and it has to stop.
This is the 7th confirmed U.S. strike, leaving a total death toll of 32, while also raising questions about the administration's use of deadly force.
All of these people have been blown up without us knowing their name, without any evidence of a crime.
I can tell you that we know who these people are. We know what they're doing, where they're coming from, where they're going. There is absolutely no doubt that these individuals are narco-terrorists. One of the recent strikes was a semi-submersible submarine. You don't have a semi-submersible submarine if you're just a fisherman.
The U.S. military has amassed a large buildup in the Caribbean, including ships, fighter jets, and more than 4,500 Marines and sailors. Naval Station Roosevelt Roads in Puerto Rico also recently reopened. Friday, the administration released new images of military demonstrations off the coast of Venezuela, where it's now conducting, quote, training missions.
If you are a drug dealer, you're going to think twice, 3 times, 4 times before you go on a boat to traffic drugs to the Caribbean. So what we're going to see is a reduction in the inflow of drugs to the U.S. temporarily.
The pressure campaign has some questioning whether it's part of a broader strategy to oust Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Manhattan Institute fellow Daniel DiMartino, the founder of the Dissident Project, tells CBN News the Maduro regime and the Venezuelan drug trafficking organization are one and the same.
We either keep boats and military strikes on the Caribbean perpetually, or we stop the Maduro cartel once and for all, which is not only about drugs, it's also about illegal immigration, it's about crime, it's about Russia and China.
The Trump administration has repeatedly said it does not recognize Maduro as a legitimate head of state, but rather the leader of a drug cartel. In August, the administration offered a $50 million reward for information leading to his arrest.
All right, that's going to leave us with time on the podcast today for one last thing.
We've got Matthew 6:22-23. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Just a reminder, as we talk about Hollywood and the content we're taking in, how does it change us? How does it consume our thoughts? It's just an important consideration.
There are so many documentaries about like serial killers, all this like crazy stuff. It's good to remember, like, be careful what you're taking in. It might not be the best thing for you.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a convicting verse, because when you do stop and think like, yeah, I'm willing to maybe watch X amount of hours of crazy movies, but then how much am I in my scripture? And so food for thought for sure. And that's a good spot as any to leave it on this edition of the Quick Start Podcast. As always, get on over to cbnnews.com, faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective. Lord willing, that creek don't rise up on us. See you back here tomorrow. God bless.